Okay, I think that it allows people to be unmuted in voice chat.
Oh, and now everybody is just unmuted.
Oh, excellent.
Hello.
It says server mute. I have no idea what that means. I don't know why it's just individually set for everybody.
No, I just muted myself because I don't have my good mic with me. I'll connect it in a sec.
No, it said server mute until I unclicked it for everybody specifically, one at a time. Even though I set permissions so that everybody should be able to speak.
Weird.
Alrighty.
So what other Q&A stuff did I have in the last 10 minutes?
I saw one
Three
question.
asks,
I saw one question early on asking if you were nervous when you first published your book. I was kind of curious if you were going to get back or circle back around to that one.
I already answered that one, but
Did you? I guess I missed it.
when I first published my novel, no, not really, because I'd already published, like, what, 8 House Pets books at that point.
Muzu3 asked, in the A&H Club universe and Clan Reed's universe, is it legal or illegal to clone people in their universes?
I don't know what that is supposed to mean.
Don't know either. Weird minutia questions. Alright, new guy 12354 asked, you already have multiple ongoing series, which are all very good, by the way, but do you have additional series in mind that you haven't gotten to yet?
Yes. I mean,
Don't let other people
there's a
steal
couple ones that I've just been sitting on for ages. Like, one of them is The Last Aeneid, which is Egyptian gods as superheroes. That's just been on the back burner forever. I have no idea when I'll be able to get around to that.
Isaac Root asked, what kind of sci-fi research did you look into when constructing the universe of Haven Celestia?
kind of sci-fi research, Star Trek. I mean, there's like a couple interesting ideas that I glean from here and there. But
You mean you didn't
mostly-
start scrubbing through academic papers from MIT to understand warp technology or something?
No.
Well, that's the first sketch. So you haven't missed anything, Duster 750.
And then I see some people in the chat were talking about games and stuff, since you were talking about wanting to turn a couple of your universes into games.
Say that again?
Just people were talking about, because you were mentioning that you would turn several of your universes into games, and some people in chat were also talking about it. They're just like, that sounds like a lot of work, and it sounds like it'd be very hard to do, and it'd be very dependent on sort of having a pre-existing audience.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Fortunately, I do have a pre-existing audience.
Yes.
It does sound like a tremendous amount of work.
It is no small feat.
Unless you've got a game studio in your pocket we don't know about.
Well, maybe
Well.
eventually.
That would be awesome.
If you had to give a name to the dog on screen right now, what would it be?
I don't know. Don't put me under that sort of pressure. Names are very important. Unless they're not. Which is why I haven't given this guy a name yet.
He's a border collie. His name is Bolly. If you were to have them be a game, what genre would you prefer to have them be?
Which ones?
All of them?
All of them?
Uh-huh.
I already mentioned the ones that I wanted to turn into games and what genres they would be.
I guess,
Dogman's going to be an adventure game. Because I like adventure games. And the one that I have in mind for Haven Celestia is a tactical RPG, because I like tactical RPGs. And the one I have in mind for Desert Angels is a side-scrolling beat-em-up, because I like side-scrolling beat-em-ups.
Noticing a pattern here. Mute my phone.
The pattern is the cute furry people.
Yes.
I guess if gun to your head, you had to make a House Pets game, what would it be?
Gun to my head is my brain splattered all over the floor. I don't know. House Pets, gotcha. I don't know.
Trivia game.
House Pets trivia game. No, that'd be terrible. I'd rather make a gotcha game than a trivia game.
Ooh.
Wordle House Pets Edition.
I don't know. I could see House Pets being a lot like a Night in the Woods, I guess. It's just the craziness of it.
Oh, I thought you were going to say the levels of depression in it.
No. I mean, sort of the just exploration and just meeting quirky characters, and I could see that.
Hey Greg, hey Rick, hello.
Right, we are getting close. I guess I should start announcing in different chats here.
How's everybody doing today?
Nervous as hell. Hopefully this goes well.
You did good last time, so I heard, so I'm sure that you'll be fine.
New guy asks, who's your favorite character among all your comics?
Among all my comics, that's impossible. I keep making new characters because I like all of them.
Is it okay if I ask a question here?
I mean, I guess you can.
Have you ever, like, lost track of a character, like, forgotten about them because you have so many, you don't have time to focus on them, and they kind of went by the wayside?
Probably.
Fair enough.
I mean, I don't know off the top of my head because I probably forgot about them.
I mean, that makes sense.
I should have time for one more question.
So, a couple of years ago, you did the collaborative project for Tales of Haven Celestia. Is there any other universe that you feel you'd be willing to open up and do a collaborative work on?
Probably at some point. But I feel like I would need to establish a bit more. Like, I could, like, definitely do that for House Pets, but that would be kind of weird to just have a Prose House Pets anthology without me actually writing a Prose House Pets book first. So, I know a lot of people are interested in probably Anadroids or something like that. I could see that. But there's still a lot more I need to establish about the universe first, so...
I doubt anyone would complain if you did a prose book of House Pets.
If you had the opportunity to make a House Pets cartoon, what is your dream studio that would make it?
I don't know. I only know of a couple of studios.
From Rev says, how about an In the New Age anthology? But I feel that falls in the same problem.
Yeah, there's still a lot more I need to establish about that universe first.
Alright, well, it's like 2 o'clock.
Yes, it is.
Are we ready to do this? I hope people are ready to do this. If you are in the voice chat, I would very much appreciate you unmuting. If you need help unmuting because of server quirks, there's the voice text text chat. You can just say something in there that you'd like to be unmuted. I guess Rick can take care of that. I'm going to give the talk I gave last weekend, which is Let's Write a Terrible Story, and it is an interactive talk, so I'm hoping that you guys will interact with me, or this is going to be very awkward and weird. So, I guess I'll start with a little bit about me. Before I do that, I should probably say, if anyone needs clarification on anything I say, don't be afraid to say something or type something. Maybe someone will point my attention to it if I miss it. But if you just have questions, please leave questions to the end so they don't derail what we're talking about. So clarification's okay, questions, hold them. Anyway, I'm Gre7g Luterman. Lots of you already know me. I've been collaborating with Rick since, 2013?
I mean,
I think that's
least.
Yeah, 2013, I think, is when we started, or when I started doing, at that point, it was just fan fiction of Rick's world in 10,000 Miles Up. And we've been collaborating since. I've been editing Rick's stuff. Rick's been editing my stuff. Oh, boy. I'll make up something stupid. Rick will draw it, and then it's canon. Rick will make up some offhand comment, and I'll write a story about it. And next thing you know, that's just how it is. About me specifically, I am a furry sci-fi author. I've published 5 novels, various short stories. I edited that anthology with Rick. And I've got the only book that's ever won all 3 of the fandom's literary awards. That's the Ursa Major, the Coyote, and the Leo Literary.
So somebody else makes a new one.
And I'm totally hoping that we're going to see this year that the Captain's Oath becomes another one in that category, because it freaking deserves it. That is an awesome book. Let's see, anyway, so I go to a lot of furry cons and I give talks on how to write a great story. But I thought it would be fun to turn that around, and instead of focusing on what will make your story great, it might be a lot of fun to talk about some of the millions of things that can sabotage your story, things that'll keep your story from being great. And of course, I don't actually want you to write a terrible story, but I'm hoping that if I can point out what these terrible things are and what makes them so terrible, then perhaps the next time you start to make one of these mistakes, you might stop and think, okay, there was some dude in Rick's stream that said not to do this specific thing, and then maybe you'll hit that big old backspace button and try something else. So I'd like to start with the most common problem that we see in furry stories. So if you are in the voice chat, please unmute yourself. Tell me, what is it? What is the most uncommon, or the most common problem we see in furry stories? Just shout it out or type. I don't care.
I can start. I think some of it's some degree of kind of wish fulfillment, or being overly centered around like 1 or 2 sort of kinks and losing sight of a story around it.
That definitely is a problem, but I don't think it's the most common. So let's just see if we get anybody else to take a guess.
I'd like to say shoehorned humans, like the idea that the story can't be too furry, so you have to kind of balance it out.
I definitely think that a story can't be too furry. I'm going to say that the most common problem in furry stories is starting in the wrong place. So many of these books and stories do this, that if we were to grab 10 at random, I would bet that at least half of them make this exact same mistake.
Are we also talking about stories on the internet?
Like any kind of story that you see in furry, because it's not just published fiction that's going to be this sort of thing.
I think the unpublished are going to see an even higher ratio, because the unpublished is typically not as good because it hasn't been through all the editing process. You're going to see even more of them starting in the wrong place. So, I'm going to give you some examples here. And you guys can tell me, why is this starting in the wrong place? Or what is wrong with this opening? All right? The city of Portsmouth was divided into 4 quadrants. One for the laborers, one for the merchants, one for the bankers, and one for the ruling class. Each quadrant was divided by stone walls and a huge gate. The gates usually stood open. Each was guarded by the king's men. Anybody want to guess what is wrong with that opening?
Feels like it's going a lot into details that are not really relevant to the
It is
overall
a lot
story.
of details. Yes,
Yeah.
we're jumping into details, and details is not the way to start.
It's
Also-
practically starting with exposition at that point.
Yes, it looks a lot like history, and people hate history. But the problem is more in that I thought of a really cool setting for my story, and I want to describe it so you can be immersed in it. And being immersed in a story is a good thing. Readers love being immersed, but is that where you start your story? And the answer is no. You should never, ever, ever start a story by describing anything, unless you want your story to be terrible.
It looks like the start of a Wikipedia article.
Yeah, it sounds like the start of a Wikipedia article. It does. How about this one? What's wrong with this opening? I'm so glad you could make it, the Vampire Queen told me. Armed gunmen have boarded a school bus full of children and taken them hostage. Normally, the Coven wouldn't get involved in human business like this, but several of the hostages are children from the local werewolf clan. If these children are harmed, it could destabilize our relationship with the clan. Why is this a bad place to start your story? What's wrong with this opening?
I don't really have any context there.
Yeah, I was about to say I have mental whiplash of I don't understand who's doing the hostage taking, who's defending, if at all, or what anyone's position in this world is. There's just something happening. You're thrown into the middle of it.
Yeah, I like the there is an attempt to start in medias res, but it's just a lot of extraneous details, a lot of things being thrown at you all at once, and not much in terms of a narrative.
It sounded as if it was crammed into the story. It was very weird.
Ironically, I kind of like that it's jumping right in, but I'm going to tell you what I think is really, really wrong with this opening. The thing that's really wrong with this opening is that they're still introducing. They are introducing the situation. They're introducing the setting. I'm sorry. Instead of introducing the setting, they're introducing the plot. They're introducing the situation, and this is super common in especially in furry stories. And what the writer is telling the reader is something really fun and exciting just happened, but you don't get to see it. Instead, here's 2 people talking about it. Right? That whole gunman boarding a bus, that's a fun and exciting thing. I would have liked to have seen that happening, but we don't get that. Instead, we get people talking about it. All right? So from instead of introducing, from now on, I'd like all of you to jump right into the story. Find the first exciting thing in your tale and start there, even if it means making something up. Don't worry about if something happens before that, because there's always something that happens before that. That's the nature of stories. There's always things before where any point in the story. And if the thing that happens before the start of your story is important, you can always flash back to it. So don't get hung up on starting where you feel like it begins. Start with something, some action or something intriguing. Why is this so crucial? Why is it so crucial that we start with something interesting or intriguing? Guesses? No guesses on why we want to start with something interesting or intriguing?
Well, you need a
all
hook.
stories are technically about something unusual happening. So having something intriguing happening is a prompt for the reader to have something to grasp onto. Like, this is something unusual that is happening, and that's the reason why you should be reading this story.
And somebody said it needs a hook. And
Yeah, that was me.
Exactly it. On average, you have about 500 words to grab the reader's attention. If you don't grab their attention in 500 words, they're going to put your book down, and they'll find a book that does. And 500 words is not a lot of text. It's about 2 full paperback pages. That's about all the time you've got to sink that hook, to make them go, okay, now what is going on here, and make them curious enough that they continue to read on. So think about the stories that you have written or created or thought about. What happens in the first 500 words of that story? Did you waste them by describing the setting, or did you spend them on people talking? Let's instead talk about what goes into the first 500 words of a great story. Obviously, it needs to be something exciting or something that sparks the reader's curiosity, and you may not believe this, but it doesn't even have to be directly connected to the main plot.
Arc 10 in Picarto chat says, the best opening line I remember in a book. The building was on fire and it wasn't my fault.
There you go. That is a great opening. That's the kind of thing that makes you go, okay, I want to know. We've all heard the cliche of the clock struck midnight, a shot rang out, a woman screamed. Stupid cliche starting. But when you think about that, it does make you wonder what the hell led up to this. Anyway, whatever your story should start with, it needs to be an event that draws us into this world, especially in science fiction, because you've created a whole world typically, and we need to know, or we need to be introduced to what is wrong with this world, what is screwed up about it, that's gonna set the foundation for the rest of the story. For example, that the first book I got published was Skeleton Crew. I guess we could say the first published novel in this whole Haven Celestia universe, and it's about life on a generation ship where no one's allowed to live past 60, and that's not the plot. That's just the setting. But where I started was with the funeral of a guy who turns 60, and he commits suicide as he's expected to. And then the story follows the body until it crosses paths with the main character. So I can introduce him and his life. In other words, my main character is barely even in Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is about a character who dies, and we never see him again. But it's interesting and intriguing, and it makes the reader want to know what happens next. Take a drink here, 1 sec.
Yeah. The other really good thing about that is that it's stuff that also kind of does some world building to it. So it is kind of 2 purposes there.
Yeah, it does. It establishes this universe, but doesn't really describe it. It just kind of throws you into, okay, this is where this is all set. So perhaps you're writing a story about a fantasy world where criminals are transformed into animals as punishment. I know that furries don't generally think of transformation as punishment, but let's say you were. And your main character pisses off some powerful guy by rejecting his advances. So to get his revenge, he frames your main character so she'll be turned into an animal. If that was the case, where would you start? What goes into your first 500 words? Guesses, thoughts, suggestions?
So
I guess.
the
I'm sorry,
first
go ahead.
thing I would be wondering is how late do I want to start? Because it's usually a good idea to start as late as possible.
Okay.
So where this story would get interesting, I would think, is when, like, there's a couple places that I would consider starting, like when the character is first framed. That would be a good starting point.
Uh-huh.
But if we want to go even later, it would be when the character is being sent up to be transformed into an animal.
That's definitely a possibility too. Somebody
That's
else
what I was going to say.
something? You were going to say that one?
Yeah, just like the last few moments before the transformation actually happens, like, you know, like he's resisting, trying to explain himself, and it's not working. We go from there.
One thing that I would like to propose is let's start with someone else being transformed, another criminal who's not even in the story, so that we can see the process and set it all up so we know, oh crap, we don't want this to happen to our main character when they're introduced. So, another possibility. How about if your story is about a world where it's taboo for humans and furries to fall in love? And your story is all about a main character who goes from being a pet to a friend to a lover to a mate. What would you put in the first 500 then?
I would suggest maybe like the first time the main character and their love interest meet, and like the first few feelings that go through the main character's head, and how they deal with that, how they try to cope with that.
Very early in their relationship, that's a possibility.
I would start probably, maybe not even with the main characters, but with an example of if there's this divide between the two species, a harsh example of that happening to inform the viewer what's going on here.
We could totally start with a mob scene. We could start with an angry mob that's found a human and furry couple, and they want to take out their vengeance. There's a lot of room for drama and excitement there, and it can still happen before our two main characters meet. One last crucial thing that I want to say about your first 500 words: don't feel obligated to write your first chapter first. When you first start writing your story, you might not yet even realize what that key thing is that needs to be established in your first 500. Go ahead and start with chapter 2. Write your story, and then go back to the beginning, and then write chapter 1. And this is why I don't write serials anymore. I often don't have any idea where my story is going until I get to the end. And I don't know what needs to be in that first 500 words, or it needs to be in that first chapter. But with proper editing, even if you write your first chapter last, no one will ever know that it was written out of order. They'll just think that you're some sort of genius when they realize that the seemingly unimportant events of chapter 1 turn out to be directly related to your main story. But of course, we're going to be talking about writing a terrible story, so we need to steer clear of things that make your story great. We need to know the destination of the great writer. Where is the great writer trying to go so that we can go in the opposite direction? All right? So what does the great writer want to accomplish? What is the goal of the great furry writer?
They're trying to, make a satisfying narrative with a beginning, middle, and satisfying ending, right?
I would definitely say no, that's not it. Anybody else want to guess? What is it that we want to accomplish? It's not satisfaction. Porn, says Dan. Thank you very much. No. To sell the book is what Draxfer says. Selling the book is a very good idea. I like that one. Other guesses?
Selling the story.
Yep, selling the story's been said. I'm gonna say that the great furry writer's goal is to keep the reader from putting the book down. That's it. If you think back on the first time that you read your favorite book. Was this a story that you kept in your kitchen and then you picked it up whenever you were picked it up and read a few pages whenever you were boiling water? I'm guessing probably not. Or was it a story that kept you up until 2 o'clock in the morning, even though you had to go to school or work the next day? Was it a story where you looked at the clock and you thought, I've got to get some sleep, but I got to get to the end of the chapter? And then you get to the end of the chapter and you're like, I got to know what happens next. That's the goal of the great writer, because that's the sort of book that we all love. Those are the books that we remember. Those are the ones that we recommend to our friends. Those are the ones where we count down the days until the sequel is out. So take a moment to think about all of your favorite books. There's 2 things that they all have in common. And it's very important that we know what these 2 things are so we don't accidentally put them in our terrible story, right? So what 2 things are in all of our favorite stories?
Interesting characters. Oh yeah.
Interesting characters. There we go. What did you say? There's 2 people trying to talk.
I think we said the same thing.
Same thing. Interesting characters is a good thing.
I'd say conflict.
Conflict is a good thing. Anyone else?
Progress.
I'm sorry?
Progress for the characters.
Perhaps. I'm going to say that the 2 things that all of our favorite stories have is, number 1, they're immersive. When we start reading a great story, we forget that we're even reading. We're not seeing squiggles of black ink on white paper. We're not seeing words. We're not seeing sentences and paragraphs. We're there. We're in the story. Maybe we're watching the main character, or maybe we are the main character, but we're there. We're experiencing this world. We're immersed in it. And number 2 is that we're worried about the main character. There's something about how our brains are wired that when we're worried, we focus on it. We don't want to pause what we're doing to make time for eating or sleeping or personal hygiene. We just want to keep reading. We want to know that everything is going to work out. When a book is really great, when it's immersive and it makes us worry about the main character, we'll let that book ruin our lives. And that's the great writer's goal. But not us, of course, as we want to create a terrible story. But if we wanted to write a great one, we'd absolutely want our story to be both immersive and to make the reader worry about the main character. Yummy. All right, let's start with immersive. What makes a story immersive? What makes us forget that we're even reading a story at all? Anyone guess? I'll tell you that immersive stories do 3 things. They're about a main character that we love. They're told using a point of view. And they don't include any stupid shit that distracts us from reading. All right? These 3 things are huge. Possibly the biggest things in a great story. So in our terrible story, we'll definitely want to avoid them. A great story will have one main character. And sometimes there's a secondary character that's almost as important as the main character, but even in stories like this, stories where we're jumping back and forth between two threads, the reader knows precisely who that main character is. Terrible stories muddy this about. They might have a bunch of main characters, or the author might be trying to avoid playing favorites, so it's not clear who the main character is. But in great stories, we love the main character right from the start. The main character doesn't have to grow on us. They're a genuinely likable person. Terrible stories might have a prickly main character. Crap, can you repeat that? Are you saying that you want me to go back to the in great stories, we love the main character right from the start? The main character doesn't have to grow on us. They're a genuinely likable person. Hopefully that's the part you wanted me to repeat.
I do think it's important to note that flawless characters are not typically likable. They need to have flaws to feel real.
We are totally getting to that in a bit. I have that in my notes.
Nice.
Someone in the chat asked, likable or relatable?
Boy, that's a tough one.
So
I like likable, but relatable might be a good thing too. It's that'd be one to experiment with. I think. I don't know if I've got a clean answer.
I've got one because I've thought about this. Relatable is a good thing. It is a tool that can be misused. Some of our favorite characters are people we cannot directly relate to. Their experiences, their lives are so far beyond what we have or will ever experienced. So it's a good thing to have, but don't think your character is bad if you don't have that.
No. I'm definitely in favor of likable. I think that if I think of all of my favorite books, I liked all of the main characters. I can't think of any, and you guys can probably come up with an example because there's counterexamples for everything. But in all of my favorite books, I have liked the main character.
Personally, I think that if you're doing like a good enough job, a character who is relatable and the more that you understand of them, the more likable they become anyway.
Terrible stories, on the other hand, might have a prickly main character. Having a prickly main character will almost guarantee that you're writing a terrible story, because first impressions matter. If your main character is being a jerk first time we meet him, then readers probably won't give them a second chance. Now, it is possible to write a likable jerk. I think Deadpool, for example, is my favorite example of the likable jerk. But you'll notice that he tends to be a jerk towards people who are worse than him, and that makes his jerkiness cathartic. Deadpool is the best asshole in comics. Yes, I totally agree with you, Kimba. Another great example of the likable jerk is, of course, Nick Wilde. And Zootopia gets away with making Nick a jerk because he's not the main character. Judy Hopps is the main character. And so we fall in love with Judy, and we stick around long enough for Nick to have a chance to reform. All right? Kimba says, well, he's cute, but he's a con man. Exactly. Also, I want everybody to note that not everybody is good at writing the likable jerk. It's really advanced stuff. And if you're trying this, look for some honest critique. If you can't pull off the likable jerk, try writing more basic characters before you move on to the advanced stuff. Right? What's another great way to sabotage your main character? I think it was Arcade who said this earlier. How about making them awesome? If your main character starts out awesome, then it's unlikely that we're ever going to care about them. For example, I'm going to give you two characters, and I want you to imagine a scenario where each character is in danger. All right? Character number one is a baby bunny. Imagine for a moment that this baby bunny is in danger, and she's going to need a whole bunch of luck to survive. All right? Character number two is genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist Tony Stark, and someone's trying to kill him. All right? Now, imagine that you told your two scenarios to someone. Are they going to worry about the baby bunny? Or are they going to worry about the guy who's had everything handed to him on a silver platter? My money is on the bunny, right? And that's not to say that you can't have a powerful main character. But if you want the reader to worry about them, if you want the reader to not be able to put the book down, try starting out with a humble character. Go ahead and give them power over the course of the story. Perhaps the bunny becomes a mighty wizard bunny that has to battle an evil weasel wizard. But if you want your story, if you want your reader cheering on the main character, then it's best to start out with someone we can identify with. Point of view is also crucial for immersion. A great book tells each scene from a single character's point of view. Terrible books either narrate scenes without a point of view, sort of like we're watching a movie. Rick touched on that in comics, that he prefers to do the no point of view. You're watching it as if it was a movie thing, but comics are a very different media than books. In books, we need that point of view because that's what gives us the immersion. In a terrible book, they'll head hop and tell us what multiple characters in a scene are thinking. Point of view seems to be very confusing for many furry writers, and I'll admit that when I was in school, no one ever taught us about it. Now, to be clear, when I say scene, I mean that the story changes scenes at the start of every chapter, or whenever you hit a scene break. And a scene break might be indicated with like a pound, 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 or a horizontal line, or maybe some inserted space, or even a little divider graphic. So each chapter might be a single scene, or if there are scene breaks, there could be a couple different scenes in a chapter. But no matter how a book's scenes are broken up, a great writer will, 1, choose a narrator for each one. 2, make sure that the first name mentioned is the narrator's. And 3, verify that narrator early on by showing us something that only that one character can perceive. Right? I realize that's a little confusing, so let's do a little practice. All right? Suppose we wanted to start a scene where Alice stomps into Bob's office and yells, "What the hell is going on here?" All right? But here's the challenge. We're going to do it twice. Once where Alice is the point of view character, and once where Bob is. All right? So we want to choose a point of view character. We want to name them first. Then we want to show something invisible to verify who they are. Okay? So let's start with Alice. Would anybody like to give this a shot? Anyone want to tell that scene from Alice's point of view? Not a big deal if you don't. I've got one written here. Here's what I came up with. Gritting her teeth, Alice shoved the door wide and stormed into Bob's office. "What the hell is going on here?" she shouted. I chose Alice as my point of view character. I mentioned her name first. I showed something invisible so that she was gritting her teeth, so that the reader would know that she's the narrator. Then we continue showing what she is thinking and feeling throughout the rest of the story. Mortal Dan says, Alice is an avid purist, hiding 20 years of therapy through Drug Abusers Anonymous. Okay. How about if we were to do that exact same scene from Bob's point of view? I'm guessing we probably don't have any more volunteers. All right, I'll just tell you what I've got. How about the door burst wide open and she stormed into Bob's office. He gulped in surprise as Alice shouted, "What the hell is going on here?" I chose Bob, mentioned his name first, and I showed something invisible of his that he's gulping, specifically. And then I'd continue on the rest of the scene, telling what Bob felt and thought throughout the rest of the scene. All right? What if we wanted to write a terrible story? Now, how would we write the scene? We could either show both, with her gritting her teeth and him gulping. And that would leave the reader on shaky ground, breaking their immersion. Or we could show neither, leaving the scene sterile and without a point of view. Of course, this all presumes that the author is writing in third person, but that's not the only option. So, what are 3 other good ways to wreck what could have been a great story? I'll go ahead and volunteer the first one, see if you guys can guess some more. Number 1, present or future tense narration. Don't do that. It'll wreck the reader's immersion. Anyone else want to guess 2 more?
Second person omniscient.
Second person. Yes, I've got second person down as my number 2 also. Never write narration in second person. That's just awful. Anybody want to guess number 3? How about inconsistency? Switch between first and second person, or first and third person, or change narrators in a first person story. Admittedly, there is one way to change narrators in a first person story, but you have to commit to it fully. It works like this. Each chapter has a narrator. Typically, you're switching between 2 narrators. So one narrator gets the even chapters, the other gets the odds. Secondly, you name each chapter according to the narrator. For example, chapter 1, Alice. And then I burst into Bob's office, and it's all from Alice's point of view. And then chapter 2, Bob. I was really tired of Alice's demands, I continue the story along, but now from Bob's point of view. A third way to wreck the reader's immersion is a category that I call stupid shit. I brought a non-exhaustive list with me. And it'd probably be simplest for me to give you the first one on my list so that you can see where I'm headed here. But then think about it and see if you guys can guess other things that would go in this category of stupid shit to wreck people's immersion. All right? Number 1, terrible stories may make creative use of different fonts, boldface, symbols, capitalization, or spelling. Readers want your story to be creative, not how you present it. Don't use different fonts for different speakers. Don't put text in all capital letters to emphasize it, or put a bunch of O's in wow to show that the sound is being stretched out. Don't use bold. Don't use brackets to indicate internal monologue. Every time you break away from the standard formatting that we're used to, you pull the reader out of their immersion. All right? Can we get some more stupid shit? Anyone want to guess some more stupid shit? How about footnotes? Terrible stories use footnotes. I recently finished reading a book that uses a variety of French words for no apparent reason. And then there's footnotes to tell the readers what they mean. Foreign words are very distracting. Try to minimize how many you use. And if you do include any, explain what they mean in the context of the story, either in the narration or in the dialogue. Never, ever, ever make the reader jump down to the bottom of the page, nor to the end of the chapter, and definitely not to a glossary at the end. Mortal Dan says, "Damn, caught me red-handed." Yes, don't do that. Don't do that.
We have some in translated works from English in France.
Well, we also have like French words in English that were borrowed like at the beginning of the 20th century. Then
And are now
they're basically
words that
English
were-
words now, even if you pronounce them the French way.
Right. But you start putting in footnotes to explain what they are, and you're going to wreck the reader's immersion. I understand that some books, especially like there's a great one, the annotated Alice in Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland's a very old book at this point, and a lot of the stuff was inside jokes and jokes that we've lost our context to. And so it's annotated all over the place so that you can get what was going on in the story. Yes, that's a good thing. Yes, it's going to totally wreck your immersion. You're not going to be immersed in a story when you're constantly jumping out to read footnotes. That's just how it is.
Yeah, footnotes are really not super appropriate in fiction, and not if you're nonfiction. If you're reading something technical, they can be great because there are often some tangents and stuff that are worth going into. But nonfiction, it reminds me of like when I tried to get into reading Ulysses and have a separate book that is just a companion, and like just looking back in it and it's saying like, oh yeah, this was a joke. This is a pun on this other thing, and I'm like, what?
That's a lot like the annotated Alice.
Yeah.
It's good important information, but you're not going to be immersed in the story because you're constantly being distracted, right? Number 3 on my list, the same goes for foreign names. If your story is about aliens or people from another country, then it makes sense that you would have unfamiliar names. But if there's no good reason in the story why a character should have an exotic name, then you may be making your story terrible by using them. Even if you are, for example, very familiar with Japanese names. I know lots and lots of furry fans are into anime, and they're all into all these different Japanese names. Even if you are familiar with Japanese names, your reader may not be. This would be different if you're actually writing anime, I suppose. But your reader may not be. And readers often lose immersion when they read names that they don't find familiar. They get different names mixed up. They don't know which are boy names and which are girl names. They miss subtle details about the names, like which are common names and which are old-fashioned names. If I was writing a story about Bob and Beulah, when you hear Bob and Beulah, you automatically get this imagine a very old-fashioned name, and it colors how you imagine the character to be. We don't get that in Japanese with Japanese names because we don't. Well, most of us don't know Japanese names. I couldn't tell you if it was a common name or not. Number 4 on my list, thick accents. When we were kids, we had to read Huckleberry Finn, and Jim would say things like, quote, "Say, who is you? War is you? Dog my cats. F I didn't hear some Finn. Well, I know what I's gwin to do. I's gwin to set down here and listen till I hears it again." And that was not an easy bit of dialogue. I really had to struggle to get through that one, and if I had been immersed in the story and trying to decipher that authentic Emancipation era gibberish would certainly have taken me out of the zone. Accents are a good way to differentiate characters, but you should minimize how much dialogue is in them.
I mean, you might want to think of like everything that's stupid shit as having a very high cost to the reader's immersion.
Very high cost, exactly.
Because even if like a book like House of Leaves can get away with annotations in every single page and things like that, they did that very deliberately and with a very specific purpose and with very high confidence. And you're probably at a point in attempting to learn how to write where you don't have any idea what you would be doing with those things, even if you were trying to use them in a way that fit the story. So
where readers aren't going to put up with the shit from you because they're not already in love with your writing. Probably, if they're already in love with it, you can probably get away with a lot more shit.
That's why that's why Mark Twain could get away with it in Huckleberry Finn, and it becomes a bestseller.
Right. Mark Twain could get away with it. Rick could probably get away with it. If you are not published and do not have fans counting down the days for your next book to come out, don't do this shit. All right? Number 5 on my list, add spelling or grammar. We all make spelling mistakes and we all make grammar mistakes. And even after a book has gone through multiple editors and proofreaders, it's still not going to be error-free. But each error is going to pop the reader out of his immersion. And it's going to take him some time to get back into the zone. Terrible stories have lots of errors in them. Gotta drink again. Hang on a sec. Tea. Number 6 is a tricky one. And some of you may disagree with me on this one, but bear with me. Number 6, similes outside of the narrator's point of view. This is a more subtle problem. In that book that I was mentioning a moment ago with the footnotes, they had a great simile in it. It said, the wolves ran like raindrops down a window pane. I can totally picture that. And if the scene had been told from a human character's point of view, it would have been perfect, right? But there was only wolf characters in the scene. None of them had ever seen a window pane, and they certainly had never seen raindrops run down one. So it's just sloppy. And when I was reading, it made me stop and say, hang on a second. Despite how creative it was, it didn't keep me immersed. Rick and I have been writing the Haven Celestia books, and the characters have never been to Earth, have never met anyone that has, and that makes it really challenging to describe things because it breaks the point of view if we ever compare things to what we find on Earth. I can't say that the cleanser smelled like lemons, nor that the pudding had a peanutty flavor. It wouldn't make sense to describe Geordians as having cat's eyes, because we know that whoever the narrator is, they've never smelled a lemon, they've never tasted a peanut, and they've never heard of a cat. Right. I think that's enough about keeping the reader immersed. What about making the reader worry about the main character? Right? Worrying about the main character is crucial to keeping the reader from putting the book down. Great writers make the reader worry with 3 steps. First, they hurt the main character. Then, they threaten to hurt the character more. And finally, whenever the danger is removed, more gets applied before the chapter ends. Right? A lot of new writers are afraid to hurt their characters. And you don't have to. If you want to write a terrible story, and okay, that's not really fair. You could write a good story where nothing bad ever happens to the main character, where his life is good and he's never at risk. But honestly, such a book isn't destined to be great. The main
Greg knows
character.
only in inflicting pain.
What's that?
I said Greg knows only in inflicting pain to his characters.
I know more than inflicting pain, but I definitely know inflicting pain. But if you don't ever do anything bad to your main character, and their life is good, and there's never anything wrong with them, the book isn't destined to be great, and that's because if the main character isn't in danger, the reader won't worry, and they won't feel this obsessive need to keep reading. They'll be okay with putting the book down and coming back to it later. And the end result is it won't become one of their favorites. A great writer isn't afraid to hurt their characters. They hurt them, and they hurt them badly, and perhaps it's physical pain, or maybe it's emotional pain by killing off someone close to them. Maybe the author hurts them by taking away something that they have, making them homeless or unemployed or alone. But whatever pain is inflicted on the main character, it needs to feel very real, very substantial. This pain can't be a minor nuisance like stubbing his toe or missing the train, right? To make the reader worry about the main character, we need this pain to prove that he's in very real danger, right? Now that the reader believes that the danger is real, the great author will threaten to hurt the character more. And that gives teeth. That danger gives teeth to the threat. This threat will then propel the character into action, essentially forcing him to go on some sort of quest to keep this bad thing from happening. And ideally, the writer will give the main character some sort of time limit, and that's that ticking clock, so that the character can't dawdle and he has to work quickly, right? Can anyone think of an example of a story that does that right? Could be a popular movie, could be a popular book. Anybody?
A story or what?
A story that does that right, that puts hurts the character, puts him, threatens to hurt him more, and gives him a ticking clock so he can't dawdle, and puts him on a quest.
Multiple times in the Dresden Files.
Harry Potter Chamber of Secrets.
There you go. That's one of them on my list. How about Voldemort killing Harry Potter's parents, wounding him emotionally and proving that the threat is real? Then Harry has to get the Sorcerer's Stone in the first book before Voldemort can, and that's that ticking clock. Or Voldemort will be able to reincarnate and kill other people. How about the Empire killing Luke Skywalker's family? That wounds him emotionally, and they destroy Alderaan, proving that the threat is real. Then the rebels have to destroy the Death Star before it can get into position, and that's that ticking clock. Or the rebel base will be destroyed too. Now, the third part of this writing task is whenever the main character gets out of danger, we want to put him back into danger before the chapter ends. This is kind of a tricky one, so I'm not going to ask you guys to make up examples. But instead, let's suppose that the main character is living in a cabin in the woods with his family. All right, and a pipe bursts, and the house starts to flood, and threatening to ruin the house and all of his possessions. All right, so the family has to scramble around to figure out how to turn off the water. Right? Now, admittedly, this threat doesn't put the character in much physical danger. But once the water is shut off, whatever tension there was has now passed. Right? So once the water finally gets shut off, we don't want to end the chapter there. The family needs to get their water turned back on. So they try to repair the broken pipe with an acetylene torch. Right? While repairing the pipe, the main character accidentally starts a fire. There we go. Now we've put the characters back in danger. Now we can end the chapter. All right? Then in the next chapter, the family can worry about trying to put the fire out. And if they're not able to put the fire out, then they're now going to have to scramble to escape the house before they burn to death. Right? Once they escape, again, that makes the danger past. So don't end the chapter there. Instead, this is a great time for it to start to snow, and that blizzard that they've been worried about to roll in, putting the now homeless family back into danger. Now we can end the chapter. Right? All of this can be planned out in advance, and we can chain disasters together to keep the main character in action. We do let him rest from time to time, but even when he's resting, he's still in danger. Like in the original Terminator, how Sarah Connor gets a sexy night when she's hiding with Kyle Reese. Right? Alternatively, we can chain quest goals. The characters have to accomplish A, and then they can work on B, and then they can deal with C. Or better yet, we can combine disasters and goals. The characters have problem A, so they do B to fix it, but doing B now breaks C, and now they have to do D to fix C, and so on. Characters keep fixing stuff. In the process, they break even more important stuff, so they can't stop, can't walk away. Right? Why does it matter where we put the chapter breaks? Guesses? Anybody guess why it matters where we put the chapter breaks?
So that the reader doesn't get exhausted.
That's part of it. Other guesses?
I mean, I can
mentioned
tell people why we put the chapter breaks, but
do it. Do it.
We put the chapter breaks because chapters are good for pacing, but when we get to the end of a chapter, that is an opportunity for somebody to set the book down, because we've reached a lull in the action, or we shouldn't be reaching a lull in the action necessarily.
But when the reader is wants to do something else, like maybe it's 2:00 in the morning and they want to go to sleep, they'll plan on reading until the end of the chapter, so that then they can put the book down. They don't want to stop in the middle of a chapter. But the great writer doesn't want them to do that. We do want to end chapters, but we want to keep them reading. We want them to go, I need to know what happens next. So if you end the chapter at a lull, then they feel justified. Okay, good. This is a good place to stop. I can get some rest. And we don't want them to do that. We want to ruin their lives. We want to keep them reading.
You mean you want we write page turners?
Yes, we want page turners. Exactly. We want to keep them hooked throughout the entire book. So they get all the way to the end, because every time the reader puts the book down, no matter how much they're enjoying the book, every time the reader puts the book down, there's a chance that they won't pick it back up. And if we want them to finish the book, and we do want them to finish the book because they're never going to buy the sequel if they don't finish it, the best way to do it is to keep them turning pages. All right? And admittedly, this is a really dirty trick, and you'd think that the readers would hate you for doing it, but they actually don't. They really love this sort of thing. All right? And then, at the end of the book, great author will do two things. He'll give the main character an unexpected way to win, and he'll reward him with something that he needs. Any examples pop to mind? I'm thinking about How to Train Your Dragon, right? The villagers want Hiccup to become a Viking by killing dragons, but instead he befriends the dragons, right? And then at the end of the story, Hiccup mends the fractured relationship with his dad. And he gets a girlfriend too, which is nice. But clearly the thing that's been making Hiccup unhappy is the relationship with his father. Not that he's single, right? One thing that I'd like to point out is that if you make your main character miserable by taking something away, you should absolutely, positively not give him back whatever it was that you took away. At least that shouldn't be the quest reward. A great writer will give him something else, right? Can anyone think of a story that does that wrong, that gives him something back that had been taken away?
I guess
do it.
I'm sorry.
Do it. Say it.
I guess any story where like resurrection, magic, or anything similar is on the table, because you can't count on anyone staying dead.
How about The Wizard of Oz? That's my favorite example for doing it wrong. Dorothy has a crappy life in Kansas, and she decides to run away, and a tornado whisks her off to a magical world filled with fun and excitement. And what does she get for completing the wizard's quest? She gets to go back to Kansas. Her crappy existence in Kansas.
And you'll notice, literally all of the sequels retcon that.
Why? Because it's a crappy ending.
Maybe also some parts of the Narnia books.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe not all of them. Not all of them.
Just back where they were.
Not all of them, but the most popular ones were kind of back to the same age and part of their adultness.
It's disappointing for the reader.
Yes, they lose their adult character from when they evolved in Narnia, and they revert back to their age and their condition.
Anyhow, L. Frank Baum might have thought that this ending of Wizard of Oz was a wonderful reward. But I don't think that I'm alone in finding it disappointing. Dorothy doesn't seem to grow, her life doesn't seem to improve, and she just ends up back where she started. And yeah, she's all happy about being home again, but just wait until tomorrow when Miss Gulch returns to have Toto euthanized, right? Now, this isn't to say that our main character can't regain what he's lost. Pretend for a moment that you're in an alternate version of How to Train Your Dragon, all right? And in this version, we hurt Hiccup by making him homeless, all right? Hiccup is tired of Stoic's crap, and so he runs away. He has a grand adventure where he befriends dragons and he gets a girlfriend. And so at the end, we can have Hiccup shack up with Astrid so that he's no longer homeless. But the quest rewards are the dragon friendships and the girlfriend. It's not that he's got a place to live. This is a very different ending than letting him move back in with his dad. That's the sort of ending that we'd put in a terrible story. I'm running low on things to do in this terrible story, and I've used up about an hour, so I don't want to go on too much longer. Does anyone have other things that they'd like to toss out that'll ruin a story? Go ahead and shout them out.
I would say having a kind of a Deus Ex ending where things just get resolved out of Yeah, that just get resolved.
Oh,
that weren't set up at all.
That's
may
a
I
great one.
go for that one?
If the main character didn't deserve the ending, if it just kind of happens and the main character didn't earn it, it's very unsatisfying. Yes. What else were you saying?
May I go?
Yeah, do it.
Kind of like the opposite of the Deus Ex Machina, an ending where there's like a sudden twist that just like invalidates the story and makes the main character's effort pointless. You see this a lot in horror, which I guess is some people like, but that always just really bothers me.
Sure, that'll ruin a story.
So basically,
Other things that'll ruin a story. Say again.
So basically, the last 2 seasons of Game of Thrones.
Yes.
Other things.
I was also thinking about the kind of stories where you have the main character, but it's just kind of a spectator of the story, and events happens, and he gets some things, but he's not really seem to be involved.
Invested in the main
Passive
character
protagonist.
because he's not the one doing. Sure.
Yes, it's
we're not
kind
gonna
of mistake in the point of view.
Yeah.
I would say best way I could say it is a Hippocratic narrative where the narrative or the characters in the story they're doing things and they're trying to prove that it's their way is good, and they're very much leaning into their way is the good way, best way. Yet everything you see is basically proving to the contrary. It's like, no, all these guys are dicks. All these characters are dicks. This is wrong. Everything you're saying is wrong.
How about the info dump? That's a great way to ruin a story. Some authors will spend ages on world building, figuring out the languages and the cultures and what magic can and cannot do, and politics and food and religion and architecture and taboos and commerce and you name it. And though it's great that they know so much about their setting, that extreme world building can really lead to a terrible story. And I realize that one is counterintuitive. It seems like a well-crafted world would lead to a well-told story, but it isn't generally the case. If a great story isn't about the setting, it's about the characters. And sure, readers love well thought out plots and settings, and we love descriptions that are so vivid that we can imagine being there, but the stories are fundamentally about people.
I would think that depends on the execution.
I'm going to say that people, that your characters are going to trump your plot, and your plot is going to always trump your setting. Because when we read a story, we're reading to be connected to that main character. Other things.
There are often kind of advice is to not write the encyclopedia of your lore inside.
Don't write an encyclopedia.
Do the Silmarillion for a different book.
Another thing I would say is an interesting one because both character lacking agency can ruin a story, as well as using
stories on rails.
Right, and also using contrivances to resolve things. But I find both those interesting because those tend to be okay earlier in the story. If your character is flung into an environment where they have no control and can't do much, that can be interesting at first. And if you have these incredible coincidences that set up events, that's typically okay. But if you try and resolve your story with these things, that's where things do not feel satisfying or keep people engaged.
It's fun to use coincidence to make the situation worse. When you use coincidence to make things better, it didn't matter because he turned his back at just the right moment. That's less fun than he happens to walk in the room at the wrong time and finds out that this shit's going down. Yeah. So coincidence or lack of agency. is a lot of fun to use for making things worse.
Like an example of that is that if your character is like going to win the lottery, you want that to be the start of the story, not the end of the story. So because
that ruins it all.
Yeah, because that even if this is like a turn of good luck for the character, it should be the start of his problems, because that's what's going to drive the interesting part of the narrative.
One caveat is if you use happy accidents for comedy. I think
happy accidents for what?
Comedy for making something to make the reader laugh.
For comedy. Okay.
Yes.
Gotcha. Sure. Another great way to ruin a story, purple prose. Please don't write fancy sentences. It's a distraction. Write how you talk. That's it's much easier to get immersed in a story if we don't have to unfold it all. Yeah, it's cool to have a great metaphor, but if I'm going to be reading along and I have to stop and unfold it and go, oh, because this is like that, and oh, that's clever. Yeah, I'm very impressed with your cleverness, but I've lost that immersion. And immersion trumps cleverness. Also, Mary Sue's. That's one everybody loves to bring up. Don't make a Mary Sue. Nobody wants to read about a character that's smarter than everyone and stronger than everyone and more attractive than everyone, and just don't do it. I'm like way over my time. I'm going to hand this back to Rick, and thank you so much for having me on your Still at Home Con.
Thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much.
That's great. So.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for the tips.
So does anybody have any additional things to add to that? I know a little bit about writing stories.
I have a general question. Sorry if I interrupted anyone. About how to deal with local cultural difference, like local expressions, like for example, between Earth countries, you don't exactly have the same expressions and uses to make comparisons, to have the characters react and to make them interact, and also it can be applied to science fiction between nations too. So I'm wondering how EV or light should they be used?
Well, expressions, that usually depends on how willing you are to interrupt. Like, just like, this is one of those things that you can get away with it a little bit, but it's like with the original publication of Harry Potter. When they made the US edition, they changed a lot of the British expressions and turned them into American expressions, just because the British way of doing it, at least at the time, is slightly different from the American way of doing it. And in that case, a British writer is probably just going to be using British turns of phrase anyway, even if they have American characters, usually because they don't necessarily know any better. And for the most part, like, if that's just for a British audience, it doesn't really matter too much. Mostly because, like, we automatically understand that if say I was writing a book that took place in France, but I wrote the entire book in English, I might as well have all the characters be speaking idiomatic English in whatever language that I'm doing, because because I'm translating it for the audience. So in that case, there's not really anything necessarily wrong with just using your own idiomatic forms of language. Now, if you want to do that to make a character distinct, usually what you have to do is make sure that it's understandable in context, even if the reader isn't necessarily familiar with this turn of phrase. Or, if it's not that important, just put it in and let the reader be a little bit confused. Having a character say something in a unusual way isn't necessarily immersion breaking. If you do, because characters may just have unusual ways of talking all the time, and it's just like, okay, just let that wash. The reader should be able to be like, okay, just let that wash over you. They said this weird thing, I don't get it, but the story's still going.
My question comes from a few things. For example, I'm French. I was raised with French as a native language. English is my third for records. And when I write in English, I have turns of the phrases, the sentences, sometimes in French, and also in character dialogues. I often deal with people from very different cultures interacting, and so I was wondering if it aided some kind of more realism, or more sometimes it can be for comedy, sometimes it can be for to give a feel about a mood and ambiance to the story. So I was wondering. That's why I was wondering if I should use it heavily or not, especially in science fiction settings, because I often kind of feel that for example, the Event Celestial stories are sometimes a little US mind dead in the way the interactions happen, for example.
Trying to see if I understand what you're saying here.
Sorry?
I'm trying to see if I understand what you're saying here.
Do you want me to rephrase?
Yeah.
Yes. My question comes from I happen to write this kind of different expression anyway because of where I was raised, and I also happen to think it might be useful to bring a little more or less of this in character dialogues or interactions, because it adds more feel that they are really from different cultures. So my question about how heavy or not it will be is some kind of a little biased, because I come from a non-US centric point of view for writing the universe.
Okay, so that's not necessarily like a bad thing, because all writers are going to have like their own voice. It's mostly just a matter of, do you understand what a very basic English voice is going to sound like? Because if you use like a French turn of phrase and just directly translate it to English, it doesn't always work. Because there's going to be like certain things in English, like even between American and British English, that are like fixed idioms. It's just going to be the same in English all over the place, because that's just how the word is used in English. And if you do it in a different way, it can be interesting if you like relegate it to like these characters, or maybe it actually works fine in English, and it's just something that you do. But that would come with like a lot of writing experience to write in English in a way that is still your personal turns of phrase, but doesn't necessarily confuse an English reader when they're trying to understand what you're getting across in your writing.
My main difficulties for writing in English is especially one kind of sentence is in French. We have the structure named il, a, which is sometimes translated with something ago, sometimes with since something, sometimes with for duration, and sometimes with the there is. And so it's the kind of thing that is very confusing to write in English. And it takes time.
Yeah. I think when working in a foreign language that's foreign to you, a lot of the difficulties come from needing to put your mindset sort of in that. Like if I'm trying to express my thoughts like in Spanish or in Japanese or something else that I know, I do have to do some sort of like with Japanese, it's frequently like just working backwards from in terms of either syntax or what sort of I'm going for, or Spanish thinking like which is more similar to English, just remembering that all of the prepositions and stuff like that are like prepositions are used pretty differently with a lot of phrases and stuff like that. But getting into that sort of mindset is really what sort of takes, because otherwise it sounds like I'll use like kind of Englishisms in that just sound wrong, or worse, if I'm trying to speak Portuguese and using like way too many Spanish-isms that a native speaker would be like, no, we don't talk like this. I don't know what you're trying to say. I get what you're trying to say, but it just sounds very off. So yeah, I think that just comes sort of with experience. And if you have an editor, who's a native speaker in that language, that helps a whole lot, catching a lot of sort of that stuff, I think. So
yeah, okay, thanks.
Kimba, how do you make a perfect ambiguity? Let's say on a character's appearance or perception of events. Well, one of the things that you probably don't want to do, especially when you're still learning how to write, is just keeping something ambiguous to the reader that would be obvious to all of the characters. That's something that's very difficult to do correctly, specifically because if it's really obvious to all the characters, you're going to basically skip every time that it should have come up, and it will probably be very obvious unless you know exactly how this sleight of hand is working. And that's usually why you don't want to do it. That's called the part of that is the tomato in the mirror trope, where it turned out at the end of the story the character looks into a mirror and they were a tomato all along. That's not necessarily something that makes and it's also not something that makes a story more interesting if you're just trying to hide this sort of thing from the reader. If the things that are going to be ambiguous are usually going to be the things that aren't actually part of the story that you're trying to tell. Like the ambiguity comes from things that the characters don't know, or things that the characters aren't present for, or things that the characters have only heard rumors about. Like that's the perfect kind of space to create an ambiguity in. If it comes up in the plot, it needs to be something that's concrete, that you can see and know about and understand. Or at least insofar as the characters can see and know and understand about it. If the characters are unable to understand something, then that's another space for ambiguity to pop up.
The idea of the adding layers of ambiguity for ambiguity's sake is making me think back to our recent Phoenix Wright streams, How some of the things, especially since the game is from a first-person perspective, there's a lot of times where we're like, clearly this thing is this, but it takes us like 45 minutes for the characters to realize it.
Yeah, and the Phoenix Wright does that specifically because it's trying to be a video game and it needs to hit several of these plot beats in a specific order in order to make it a puzzle for the player. You don't really want to do that in an actual story. Transformers fanboy Wolf. How should I go about determining the scope of a story? For example, should I make this story some huge epic tale that runs for several volumes, or should I write it shorter? Personally, even if you have like an idea for a huge epic story, if you haven't actually written a story before, try writing something shorter. Just try making a story that will be interesting on its own and isn't all that long. If you really, really want to just immediately jump into an epic fantasy, get ready to rewrite it a lot as you gain experience and realize that as you go back, oh, this really wasn't all that good to begin with. I need to start over with this from the beginning.
Yeah.
How do I decide?
If you're just starting out, you probably just want to write a scene. Write one scene that you think is interesting or you think has to be in the book. And then find out what happens just before that scene. What happens just before that scene. What happens just before that scene. Or what happens just after that scene. Like, and then find these different scenes that you like. And then find the ways to connect them. And then, oops, you've made a book.
How do I decide which idea to tackle first, / which ones are worth fleshing out or worth writing? Well, first you probably want to filter them by which ideas you have actually involve characters doing something that creates where they're in a situation that has created problems for them. Because that's where a story is. And you need, like, even if Tolkien wrote an huge encyclopedia of his ideas about elves and whatnot, when he actually decided to write a story in that setting and he made The Lord of the Rings, he said, okay, actually, we're going to make this into the Third Age, which hadn't existed before, because he had an idea of a very specific problem that the characters had to overcome, and that's where he started with that one. After, grafting The Hobbit onto everything. If you have a rough outline of the world's history but not much else, well, pick a point in history because you're not going to be able to cover all of it. Which point in the history of your entire world is... Yeah, which point in the history of your entire world has something happening that you can create a scenario for your characters to have problems in?
So, would you suggest, like, in terms of, like, sticking to sort of small scenes and stuff like that, do you feel like it's like useful going through the exercise of writing out basically maybe even just like one chapter of something and going through the entire, sort of finishing process from it, just from, getting a first draft, having, multiple edits to it, having some third party edited and getting sort of, and imagine it'd be like, there's a lot of value in getting that exercise, even if you're not going to write an entire novel at that point.
At some point, you just have to start writing.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to gain experience just by rolling everything around in your head. You actually have to start practicing the craft, because there's a lot that goes into the craft that you just sort of skip over when you're just thinking about it. So there's a couple like rules of thumb, like everybody has a million terrible words in them that they need to get out first. That's not literally true, but when you start writing, it's not going to be perfect. You're not going to burst out the gate as J.R.R. Tolkien, and you should not expect yourself to be J.R.R. Tolkien out the gate. You really need to be okay with what you're able to accomplish at this moment. And in order to do that, you need to just be able to write something that you can accomplish at this moment, even if it's terrible. That's sort of why National Novel Writing Month is still very instructive, because even if you're going to... Because it just tells you, sit down, write 50,000 words in 1 month. And they're probably going to be terrible words, but you are going to learn a whole lot about the craft and how you sit down and think about writing and how you construct scenes and how you come up with ideas and characters for a very specific plot that you're trying to create. Just doing all that, even if you throw the novel away afterwards, even if you never do anything with it again, you have learned a lot about the craft at that point.
Yeah, gotcha. Thanks. Yeah, that's the funny thing. I haven't attempted to do any fiction writing in a few years, but I think like a friend and I were kind of challenging each other to write, horror kind of short stories and stuff like that. And getting your first draft, or getting your ideas on or just writing out a scene just from your head once you get past inhibitions and stuff like that is that felt like the easy part. The hard part is like, oh crap, what am I gonna do with I spent 3 paragraphs on this one intro thing. Where is this dialogue going? And trying to cobble things sort of together into something cohesive from that draft.
That's a lot of what I learned doing house pets and everything, especially when I was mostly just winging it. It's just I'm in the middle of a story. I actually don't know where I was going with any of this, so now I have to come up with some way to resolve it that makes sense. And it worked maybe 50% of the time, but it was also very stressful. So now that I've finally learned a lot about how I write and what I want to do with stories, and if I feel like even me just feeling good about how this story turned out, that's very important for me to know, because especially early on, I'd sometimes write things because I feel like I'm expected to write them, even if they're not necessarily for me. Now, even if they're not necessarily something I wanted to do, I feel like it's boring. But when I write now, I have to make sure that what I'm writing is either leading immediately into something that I feel is important, that I need to get across, or something like that. Even if I'm writing off the cuff, with some of my stories on Patreon right now, I'm sort of writing off the cuff. I know sort of where I need to go. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to get there, but in the meantime, I should be writing each scene with some eye towards what's interesting for me, because if I'm writing something that I feel is boring, the reader is probably definitely going to feel that it's boring.
But when you say you have been writing for Patreon, do you mean you haven't written the scenes you have in your head yet? Do you mean that?
The stuff in Patreon, I have several scenes in my head of things that I want to do in the stories, but I don't necessarily know how those scenes are actually going to connect together.
But have you put them currently on a Word document or not?
I do not have any of them written down. They're just in my head.
Right.
Like, I could write them down, but at that point, I might as well be writing the story. Although I do like have outlines for other things that are much more structured. Those are also like rough suggestions. I don't necessarily know that this scene is going to perfectly fit the way that I wrote it in the outline. But at the same time, this is a first draft. I should not care that much. If something happens to be wrong with the way that I wrote the scene, I can fix it in post. How could I work not safe for work content into something without making it feel too smutty or horny? How can I keep myself from getting too carried away with such things as I honestly tend to do? It depends on what your goals are. If you're just writing porn, nobody really cares. They just want to see the porn. But if you're writing a story, which we're typically talking about, it kind of needs to fit somehow into the story. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the sex has to fit into the plot. It can just fit into the characters, because because a sex scene can definitely be a part of a character's emotional arc that's necessary for them and is good for the plot and carries things forward and makes the reader understand things about the characters. But the problem with a lot of not safe for work stuff is that they tend to just like ignore the characters when the sex starts, because I have all of these sexy ideas that I want to hit all the beats of, and the characters are going to do these things, and that's not necessarily part of the story anymore. You just stop the story, and it's time for some weird porn, and we will start the story up again afterwards. If you're doing it correctly, everything that has led to this moment still affects this moment, and this moment will affect everything that happens afterwards. That's how you properly tie not safe for work material into a story. It has to have the same sort of lead-in and consequences as any other scene in the story would.
Gotcha. So it's kind of some of the same logic around writing, say, action scenes, where they do need to tie into the plot. They need to have there are like stakes happening.
Yeah, because
there's motivation for the scene to exist.
There's like this semi joke, like, if you don't know what's going to happen in your story, just have something explode. Explosions can be interesting. Like, I've written plenty of explosions, but in order for an explosion to actually mean something in your story, it needs to actually have consequences. Because if something just explodes and nobody ever comments on it again, that's just like a weird thing that happened. It's not really part of the story.
When you mean sex must have consequences, the scenes. What about the stories with Rinchel in them?
With what?
The stories with the species in Haven Celestia that always have sex.
Oh, with Ringle?
Yes, Ringle. Okay, I pronounce Rinchel. So how can we deal with them, because they do it very often?
Well, I mean, if you're just going to be like overtly horny with it, then you just have the story happen around the sex, because if this is like it'd be like describing a character like eating a sandwich, basically, because in a given story, you're probably not going to just sit down and have the characters eat a meal together like regularly as it would happen in real life, because everybody probably eats 4 times a day. But when you bring it up in a story, you really only bring it up when scenes require it, or when you possibly just need something for the characters to do in the scene when something else is going to happen. So just in those cases, just treating it casually without any necessary over focus on getting through the activity is because, especially if you have a dinner scene, you might just have the characters sit down to having dinner, or maybe they're talking through the dinner, or maybe you only mention it when the dinner's basically over and they're having dessert. So if you're going to do that, you don't necessarily have to explain everything. It's just something that's happening casually, like any other mundane task that the characters might be participating in the course of a scene.
Okay. Just for information, I think there is some kind of drama in the Picarto chat because they don't seem to be acknowledged.
The problem is they haven't asked any specific question. They haven't said anything about writing. I've been keeping an eye on them. I've been trying to interact with them in chat, but they haven't said anything to be brought up.
No, the comment about the observation about writing a scene of characters eating dinner, my mind went to George R. R. Martin spending an obscene amount of detail on food and how good everything sort of looks. You can, I guess, I'm not the expert here, and I don't write very much. I think there are cases where you can go all out to make a point of something. If you're describing a 200 person banquet, I think you can go into stuff.
George R. R. Martin can usually get away with it because there's usually enough drama in his stories that you're still, even during those scenes where he's describing a bunch of stuff, you're still waiting for the other shoe to drop on something else that had been happening.
Yeah, that makes, yeah.
There we go. Rick Griffin, what initially inspired the Haven Celestia universe?
What inspired it? That's hard to say. I know where I initially started the idea was when I drew a picture in 2011.
I have one for you. Was Snakes Conquer Earth your first sci-fi thing, before Haven Celestia? I guess your first sci-fi writing.
I guess if we're talking about outside of fan fiction. But if it's outside of fan fiction, no, In the New Age is technically science fiction, and that would be the first one. Let me bring up the picture that inspired Haven Celestia, because it's still buried deep in my For Affinity gallery.
Collector K9 asks, in my fantasy universe, clothing is very uncommon. How would I handle this in a manner that makes logical sense and doesn't make the readers uncomfortable? Well, sounds like your readers are cowards.
Well, in Haven Celestia, it just doesn't come up a lot. it really only comes up when like the attention is drawn to somebody's genitals for some reason. Like otherwise, it just isn't commented. Just like there's no clothing. You don't necessarily need to write down, oh, and everybody's naked all the time in this chapter too. Like that's just going to be understood at a certain point that nobody's actually wearing anything except for like the bare minimum. And like when people are reading that sort of stuff, even if they know that the characters are all naked, it doesn't create anywhere near as visceral a reaction as having it actually sketched out for them. Like even with like in Haven Celestia, since all of the in-book images I have are conveniently censored, that doesn't necessarily impart any additional lewdness to the readers. That's what the actual sexy parts are for, and it's like it might as well be that they're all clothed. They just happen to not have any clothes on. Yeah, this is way back.
For me, at least, I definitely had that moment where I realized that because I was reading A Vast and Empty Sky the other day, and it came across that one scene where Reese is dressing himself up in the bathroom, and that's the moment where you're just like, oh yeah, he's not wearing anything. Because it goes into detail about how he's like looking at his genitals and stuff, and he's like, should I do anything to like spruce this up? For a diplomatic mission, should I highlight my balls or anything?
I thought that was kind of funny because it was necessarily an appropriate place to bring it up, just to hammer in just how to what sort of importance they attribute to the parts that everybody can see.
Yeah, it made me feel like yes, his to Reese, it is normalized that he is objectified for his looks, which is an interesting sort of like, no, this is like a thing that it's not just that it happens, it's that it's normalized for him where he doesn't even question it.
Oh, where is it? It's somewhere around this time. There it is. I'm going to paste this into the voice chat. If somebody could repaste that into the Picarto chat, that would be nice. That was I drew that picture. That was the original. That was like one of the original concepts I had for Haven Celestia, because I was like, you know what? I really like giant windows overlooking an entire planet from not too far away. And I want to write a story that has that in it. So that's what I did. And I also had like 2 kangaroos in it.
See, I appreciate the giant golden orrery, but maybe that's just me because I like geometric things.
The question that pings off that, Rick, how do you keep track of all your various characters' voices? You keep references, just remember them. Well, you can keep references if you want, but I typically have to hold everything in my head, because if I don't remember it, it's probably not important enough, or I'm not doing a good enough job with it for it to have stuck. Because like when I'm writing Inzari in the books, she has a very distinct voice in my head. So she's always going to come across a certain way. It's like so long as I remember that, I am writing Inzari, various impressions of the dialogue I've written for her before immediately spring to mind, and I can just start writing in that voice again.
Are there any characters that you've had difficulty with finding a voice for?
All the time. Tesco evaded me for over a year because I knew I wanted her as a character that we were going to follow, but what her specific voice wasn't necessarily sticking with me. I had I tried various hats out on her to see if she could do this sort of thing, if she could be that sort of thing, but that's the reason that I didn't fall back onto something else that was very specific that I could do was because I needed to develop a voice for her that would make the most sense for the main character of this story.
Jim Bunny and Picarto asks, I really enjoyed the audiobooks, but how do their voices in your head compare to those?
They're completely different, but it's not necessarily a problem because somebody else's performance isn't necessarily going to affect the words I hear in my head. It's the words that I hear in my head are basically going to probably stay there forever because even if I read them out loud, I did that basically twice, I'm not going to come up with the perfect voice on my own anyway. Even if I was a trained voice actor, I still only have a limited range of voices that I can personally do. I can't do a female voice or anything like that, so even have female voices in my head for female characters, it's not going to get out of there anytime soon. So when I'm listening to Rafe do the audiobook version, it's basically an adaptation of my stuff, and it's I enjoy it as an adaptation. It doesn't necessarily throw me off or anything.
I was gonna say, Zari doesn't sound like a middle-aged British man.
No. Hey, see you, Lunchbox? Learning to put an affectation on your voice, like any kind of voice, is a lot of work, and that's why you pay voice actors to do things that you can't do yourself. But if it's important to you, you will work at it and figure out how to do it within the range that you have.
So you were saying earlier that House Pets is not coming to an end in the current arc, but you do have a lot of other projects going on. Are there any of them that you have an end in sight for?
Yeah, several of them. Dogmen, I really only plan on having the one story for them. It is possible that there could be more stories afterwards, but I'm really only planning on just the one story, and that will be it. It will be a very big story. It will have a lot happening in it, but it's just going to be one story. I sort of have an idea of where I want Anadroids to end, but I'm really not sure if that's actually where it's going to end.
Hey Rick, by any chance, the Haven Celestia, the TTL books, will be an animated movie someday?
I mean, I'd like that. But, that requires, certain types of commitment that I do not have time to apply. That, goes for everything that, hey, you should make this into an animated series. Well, first of all, that's a lot of work. Second of all, that requires investment, not just of money, but of time. And like, even if I somehow conjured the money out of the ether to pay people in order to make this thing a reality, I still technically have to be involved in that process if I want it at all to match anything that's in my head and not just some other guy that I'm paying to do this.
Even if you hire somebody else.
Even if I hire somebody else, because if I hire somebody else to do a story, it will be that person's story. It won't necessarily be my story. Now, I might like that person's story, but it doesn't necessarily make it my story. And if people are doing this to if people want this to be my story, then I do still have to be involved, even if it's like just as like showrunner. If I'm like imagine conjuring up like an entire animation department to turn House Pets into a series. How are they going to do that? Are they going to adapt everything directly? I wouldn't want them to adapt everything directly, because not everything that's in the comic can be adapted in one-to-one into an animated show. For one, all of the arcs are of vastly varying lengths. They need to have like different things introduced into them. You need to know exactly how long a show is going to be. You need to and you need to be able to adapt characters into a form that they can be animated within the budget constraints that you have. So if I wanted a say on how the characters are changed into a more animation-friendly format rather than the comic format, then I would need to invest my time in that, because even if I hire someone else to do, it's going to be what they think is best to change these characters into an animation-friendly format. It's going to be what they think is best to add to these stories in order to make them into full cartoons, or if they're inventing something whole cloth, it will be whatever their ideas are for a story. Like, there's just like a bunch of things that go into this. And yes, I can hire somebody else. You can always hire somebody else to do that thing for you. But at a certain point, like if I'm just hiring somebody to make a cartoon that just has the House Pet's name on it, and I step away from it and they just do whatever, I haven't really made anything at that point. I'm not making anything, and that's really the thing that I want to be doing, is making stuff.
I've got a question.
Yes.
It's mostly about what Greg said, so it's not well, it's not here anymore. So, but I think your input could be insightful, useful. What about the big question about writing furry stories to make them more mainstream, especially furry science fiction? What about Wattpad? Because I noticed that the stories are usually posted on very furry-centric fandoms, except maybe sometimes DeviantArt for the most tame ones. And so I was wondering why people of the fandom don't post much on Wattpad, and would it be useful to do it?
I have no idea. I've never used Wattpad. I don't know why people use Wattpad.
It's kind of generational, I think. It's kind of a new YouTube, but for text.
Okay, I still have no reason to publish anything on Wattpad myself, though.
Maybe you. It's for mostly free text, free stories.
Well, yeah, that's part of the thing, is that it's still basically the issue with just providing all this stuff for free. Like I provide house pets and most of my comics eventually for free in order to drive up engagement, but that's like an advertising strategy. If you're just like doing that, posting on Wattpad, well, there's like 10 million stories on Wattpad. People don't necessarily know what they're going to look for, and that's why part of the marketing thing is being able to build an audience. And I don't have an audience on Wattpad. I don't know how I would start getting an audience on Wattpad. But the people who are on Wattpad obviously, possibly, have figured out how to build an audience there, and that's basically how they're doing it. So like being able to like build this sort of thing is going to be like very different for everybody. Because I wouldn't necessarily recommend anything that I did to people in order to say, oh, just follow this 12-step program and you can be as popular as the house pets guy. No, that's not going to work, because the internet and where all the people are looking to get their entertainment, that's always changing, that's always shifting. So I have no idea if Wattpad is any good right now. I have no idea how much engagement it actually drives, or how much, if it is actually easier or if it's harder, because that's not somewhere that I think about posting my writing.
But do you think it has some potential fandom-wide? I mean, like I noticed there are a lot of people posting from the fandom on Safari, on Fair Affinity, sometimes on Inkbunny too, but it's always fandom centric. And I was wondering if the writers posting free stories on Wattpad too could be an interesting way to branching out somehow, to kind of find a new audience.
Well, the reason that people post their furry stuff in furry spaces is because that's where furries are looking for it. I mean, you can post furry stuff in Wattpad, but you are necessarily advertising to whatever furry space is on Wattpad. And you possibly are capturing a segment of an audience that isn't furry, and that's sometimes a good idea. That's probably a good idea to capture an audience who isn't furry, because the furry converts need to come from somewhere. But
well, the question is, like, what's your in with the people who are in WhatsApp, right? As you were saying, people posting for Affinity and DeviantArt and all these other places, they already have the foot in the door of being like, I have a furry story here. And then they immediately get a look because the person's like, well, I want to read furry stuff, so I'll read that. In WhatsApp, you don't have anything there. You don't have that initial hook that at least will have people take a second glance. So it's like, sure, there are technically other people out there, but it's like you're going to get such a small portion of them to actually look at your story. Is the time to put it on there worth it?
Well, I think the core of the question is about not to make the furry fandom mainstream, but to.
Well, I'm not even saying to make the furry fandom mainstream.
No, I mean from my questions, I got the feeling that something that Greg pointed out was about how furry stories are not very appealing, but in a kind of general and mainstream way too. I mean, I come from a community of writers in science fiction and fantasy and horror from the French language side of this kind of fandom. So I had some kind of experience there about the tips, and most of the tips also fit what's from the kind of the mainstream science fiction and etc. And my feeling was maybe people that already like science fiction, for example, because it was the topic of the panel, could be kind of interested by such stories if they were better written and posted on non-furry centric websites.
It's still a matter of marketing. I mean, getting a story in front of people who aren't necessarily just going to enjoy it for the furry aspect, well, you're still, if you're just at marketing this as just like, hey, this is science fiction, and it also has furries in it, but we'll not mention that thing. This is science fiction. It's like, oh, I'm looking for science fiction. I will attempt to read this, and that, and if you've done your job well enough, then maybe. But at the same time, you don't necessarily need to capture that demographic if you're not looking, like if you're not looking to like specifically market to that demographic, because a lot of what we're doing is just writing furry fiction because we like this stuff and are not necessarily being marketed to by popular or mainstream writers, because basically all of the books out there are about human characters. And so we write these we write the furry fiction, and you can put it out there and say, hey, you can just read this as a story, don't mind the fact that there are no humans in it. But a lot of people just simply don't bite anyway, because they prejudge it for not having human characters. Like, oh, this doesn't have any humans in it, how can I relate to these characters? They don't even try. Okay, and that sort of the thing. But like, I sort of hope that, like, in the future, there's like a momentum to build there, where people realize that obviously you can relate to characters who aren't necessarily human, and it doesn't necessarily take away from the story.
Well, it's already done in fantasy. Like one of the founding novels is for fantasy is The Wind in the Willows, and you got series such as Red Wall from Brian Jacques, and they are not very recent there. So, is it something kind of specific to science fiction, that science fiction isn't mature enough for as a readership or another audience that with kind of the mindset people still need to be human to relate to them?
Even when you're talking about
in fantasy, it seems kind to be more accepted that the character isn't human.
But even if you're talking about fantasy, like at least in the Anglosphere, that sort of fantasy, like Wind in the Willows, is very distinct from high fantasy, like everything that follows after Tolkien. Because, like, you'll notice that in basically took until Dungeons and Dragons until very recently to finally accept that yes, there are a ton of furries playing this games and they want more non-human characters than, humans with pointy ears or short humans. Because like something like Dungeons and Dragons doesn't model itself after Wind in the Willows or Redwall, even though it easily could. It's so that for a lot of people, that's like a separate sort of fantasy. That's more appropriate for children. That's not an adult fantasy like the Sword of Shannara or whatever.
Oh my god. I don't know if you read a lot of Redwall books, but some are very hardcore and are still marketed for children or young adults.
Yeah, well, that happens with cartoons too.
I mean, you have cannibalism in one of them. Or not exactly cannibalism, but you have scenes of anthro species eating others. So it's kind of hardcore sometimes. But I guess, well, they are animals, so pass off. Yeah, it's still for children.
Yeah, I mean, because even if you like include hardcore stuff, if it's like, oh, it's just animals doing this, it's not. It doesn't affect the reader as the normal reader as much as if humans are doing this. If humans are doing this, oh no, it's suddenly very terrible. If animals are doing it, it's that's just the way of nature.
Well, to sort of get around, I think there's kind of circling around this sort of, I guess, two questions that are related. One is, what do we do, or how do we get out of the kind of ghetto that's around that, where I guess furry kind of fiction resides, I guess within or heavily overlapping with sci-fi, which has like similar kind of issues being taken seriously or distributed mainstream. So there's that. And then but then the follow-up question is like, does this matter if you can make a living, publishing fiction in this sort of sphere?
Yeah, because like there's like some sort of expectation that you need to like mold your writing more towards the mainstream in order to be of mainstream appeal. But if that's not something that you want to do, why would you be doing it? You want to fulfill your artistic needs as close to your own as possible, and in doing so, do it in a way that invites an audience in so that they can understand it. But you don't necessarily need to compromise that much just to get a market segment if that's not really your passion.
If I may, recently, mostly from what I'm reading in the Locus magazine website, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Locus. It's there are a lot of novels and short stories getting attention recently, more about themes that are kind of less recent in the furry fandom, like kinks, like feminism, like differences in the body, discrimination, and I think a lot of themes of current science fiction, of today's science fiction, are getting closer and closer to the main themes, let's say, of the furry fandom, and I think the gap is not as wide as before for concerning mainstream science fiction that it put affronted by critics currently, at least US science fiction. Is it understandable what I said?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to do like three things at the same time right now.
Sorry. Tell me if I need to rephrase something.
I need to step away for a moment. Give me about 1 minute.
Hey.
While Rick goes away, I will ask a question of all the people here in this call. Which of you is a writer, and can you talk about what you have been writing or are writing?
I've written a couple of short stories. I have one more kind of in the pipeline, I guess, but I haven't worked on it in a while because I haven't been happy with how it's been going. Need to get back into it. It's just a matter of having the time for it.
Kanan says they are an aspiring writer that wrote House Pets fanfiction years ago. That's nice.
I was mostly a translator, but for example, I translated years ago House Pets in French, but it was a little too confidential to post in the forums for me to feel this worth of continuing. And originally, or as for original stories, sorry, I wrote a full size fantasy novel back was when I was in high school, around 400, over 400 pages in French at the time, and it was kind of I went all the way to send it to publishers, etc. Of course, it got rejected. Thankfully, it got rejected because now, when I look back at excerpt, I'm kind of very ashamed. It was a little too much characters, not enough focus on one main character, etc. So it was. I didn't know the Fairy Founder back in the day that I already had a world with anthro characters. Oh, so I wrote a short story for a friend about some kind of fiction. Prophecy of the Cycle was something related to a commission with collaborating with the author. And I currently have mostly one short story in project about Heaven Celestia with some kind of an anthro squirrel alien, but I'm struggling because it's in a setting on Earth and kind of specific because the character is very set on not being discovered by authorities. and the title is All I Want for Christmas is a Space Telescope, and it's it's about a fun idea I had around the launch on the Space Webb, James Space Webb telescope back in French Guiana, because I know a little the place from kind of personal interest, so I thought it would be funny to have kind of character concept I have meet the setting and one of the character I had in mind. But I didn't see to pan out when I'm in front of the document. So maybe later. Anyone else?
I'm not usually much of a writer myself. My interest is more in game development and stuff, but I have written a couple of stories for Haven Celestia. Particularly in one of Greg's books, he mentioned a species called the Arunians, and I have tried to sort of adopt them as a race of my own design where they're avian influenced. They're kind of like feathery wyverns that are very xenophobic, especially amongst themselves, and even more so among the outsiders from the stars.
I think some other people are away because I don't hear many more people answering. Yeah, Miller, our Letron is asking if there were a question.
Yeah, the question is if you have any experience writing, what would you like to talk about your writing, or is there something you're currently writing that you'd like to mention? I'm also in the middle of writing another story, but at the moment it's currently just an outline, and it's it's very self-indulgent.
May I say something real quick, by the way?
Yeah.
I haven't been doing a lot of writing lately, but I feel like the niche I want to cover is doing more tabletop RPG stuff, because I think there's a hole for that could be filled here, and when I get the time, I'd like to do more of that.
Is that like GMing stuff, or is that
Yeah, that's what I meant, sorry.
Books?
GMing is what I meant, sorry.
Okay. I mean, that's probably, if you're ever in the mood to just write about a world and you couldn't imagine, or you can't really stick down to one story, writing a dungeon manual book is probably the best way to do that, where it's just like, hey, here's all the details of the world, make your own individual story.
To be honest, lately, I've been getting way more into role-playing because when it comes to writing, I see the appeal of it, but part of me likes having that idea of, like, somebody working with you so you don't really know what's going to happen. You kind of bounce off ideas with them in real time, I guess. Makes sense? Like, when you're writing by yourself, you kind of know what's going to happen, and, I mean, there's an appeal to that, but... You know what I mean?
Yeah, RP has this kind of fun aspect of it's really kind of like a two-person improv session, kind of, but done in slow motion, entirely over writing. The only reason I don't do RP super very often is just how long it takes, and like waiting like a few minutes in between responses and stuff like that. But it's fun. It's fun to kind of world build and set up settings together, and do all that sort of stuff. it can be really great, especially if you're using like an existing scenario or existing characters you have, or like using like some image or scene as like inspiration for something, and like talking about the backstory of how these characters might have gotten there and stuff like that. There's just a lot of stuff that you can sort of do, and it's like pretty kind of satisfying in that way. I have had cases where an RP session where my friend ended up kind of turning it into a story, kind of like formalizing sort of parts of it and extending things, and there's adding additional scenes and stuff like that. So it's fun. Yeah.
There's definitely nothing wrong with using it for inspiration, I'd say. That's a very good idea, even.
Mm-hmm.
For writing inspiration, I should say, to be clear.
Yeah. It does make you acutely aware of your use of vocabulary and like deciding how flowery you want to use your language, or it makes it more obvious if you're using a lot of the same like phrases or the same kind of wordings or same structure more often, and sort of figuring out what sort of works. Because you scroll back at like, the last like 5 messages you've sent, and you're like, oh yeah, they all kind of start this. They have this sort of structure. Okay, maybe I should try something different. I don't know.
Yeah, that's been a big help with me. Keeping my vocabulary varied has always been kind of somewhat of a difficult thing for me as a writer.
Yeah. There's the question of like how much variation is needed versus the like the Hemingway approach of like writing as plainly and directly as possible, and yeah, sort of that's what it works. It's only a problem when you see like sometimes like overly flowery or out there metaphors that look like they were kind of made up on the spot. Sometimes that could be fun or like kind of sort of amusing. Other times it's just like, what? It kind of breaks immersion a little bit. But it's kind of the fun is that like none of this is like serious, that you're kind of you're just kind of, a lot of it's, you're building a narrative, but at the same time you're experimenting a lot. You're seeing what works and stuff like that. So.
Collector Canine in the Discord asks, how could I handle references and allusions to other stories or writers without making it seem like I'm just plagiarizing or being too unoriginal or being patronizing?
I don't know if this is what Rick would say, but I feel like you should be more fair to yourself, because really, at this point, nothing is truly original. And that's not really anybody's fault. It's just people have been writing for so long now that just so many iterations of so many ideas have been done. So eventually there's going to a point, whether you mean to or otherwise, where you're going to borrow from something and make it your own.
I think the question is less about, am I going to write a story that can be compared to something else that already exists? Because of course you're going to write a story that can be compared to something that already exists, right? That's why like the hero's journey is a thing, is because they're like, oh yeah, every story is the hero's journey. Because through very stretched and very reached metaphors, you can say that. I think the question is more about when you want to specifically call out another piece of literature or another character or another story, like by name or an author specifically. How do you do that in a way that isn't detrimental to the story? I don't know. Because I can think of many stories they do that and it is detrimental, and I can think of many stories where they do it and it's not, and I'm not quite sure the difference, right? You think of the Divine Comedies make multitude references to Virgil, who was Dante's favorite poet at that time, and it just kind of sort of works. in the actual text of the story, it maybe doesn't, because it definitely comes off that he's just like, "Oh my god, Virgil, you're so cool. You're the best author ever."
Well, one of the things is that if you're going to make an illusion like that, you need to make it obvious that it's an illusion. Like, nobody then or now goes into the Divine Comedy thinking that Dante just made up all of this stuff off the top of his head. They know that it's referencing. They know that he made up a lot of this stuff off the top of his head, but since in Italy, in his part of Italy, everybody already studied the classics like that. They all knew what he was referring to, and the problem usually arises when you're trying to hide your influences, like stealing something whole cloth from somebody else and pretending like this is something that you came up with entirely on your own. Like that's not going to be to your benefit, because making overt references to other pieces of literature should be something that the audience is in on.
Yeah, or at least they recognize that it's a reference. Yes. You might not catch every sort of thing, but there. I mean, that's what. I know this is somewhat not that obscure a reference, but Das Racist's music and lyrics is super heavy on references. There's there's probably one or two every few lines, in terms of just very wearing their influences on their sleeves, making calls back to that, but you're using them as kind of building blocks for sort of a new narrative. Like if you're making like a ton of references, like you're making if this were like YouTube 10 years ago, and you're just making some funny thing by just making references to putting in a whole bunch of memes and making references to that, it can feel like pretty awful, just really forced and stuff like that. But if you're using these references in sort of building this sort of structure in which you're telling stories, or building this sort of environment around that, that's that can be you can use that for characterization and stuff as well. Just kind of, yeah.
Now, we heard Greg talk earlier today, and love him with all my heart. I'm gonna roast him a bit here. And I'm going to spoil Reaper's Lottery a bit, so if you haven't read that yet, you might want to mute this. But there is a side story that's interleaved through Reaper's Lottery that talks about a prince who's spurned by his kingdom and sides with the slave class. And at one point in the story, he makes a promise that he's going to summon some kind of force that will kill the firstborn of every family, and the only way to avoid this curse is to take the blood of blood of a feed animal, put it over your door, and then there's this glowing light that goes door to door and takes the firstborn of the people who don't have the blood on their door. And then he gathers up the slaves and he tells his father, the king, "I would like to leave with them," and he says, "Go." He's fine, go, and they leave off into the desert, and the chapter is literally called Exodus. And Greg was talking about how you never want to write a book to put it down. That was when I saw the word Exodus was the only time I've ever put one of Greg's books down, because I thought that this was such a heavy-handed allusion. I thought it was so unnecessary to have a biblical allusion in something like this, and I was so worried it was going to go into some kind of preachy thing that I stopped reading it, and I didn't pick it up for a good couple days.
I mean, there's the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah. So that's why I say, it's hard, right? Because you need to And maybe it was me because maybe it was me. Maybe it was because it was specifically a biblical allusion. But yeah, no, it's hard to make allusions like that and not make them sort of take you out of the story anyway. Anyway, done with spoilers.
Yeah.
I have a question for Rick if he's around.
Yeah.
So, I know that you've always been very permissive on fan stuff, which is great, and we all obviously appreciate that. I'm kind of curious what your thought process is on that. What do you think of people doing fan works generally? What made you decide to open up your works like that?
Well, I guess it's because I don't necessarily feel protective of the intellectual property side of it. Like, obviously, I would prefer to be able to make money doing what I do, because I can't continue to do what I do unless I'm making money doing it, so that I can continue to pay for doing it. But at the same time, like 99% of stuff that 99.99% of stuff that fans do isn't going to affect that bottom line. Like, I don't know why people would necessarily be so protective of it. Like, I used to be protective of it for a while because I was afraid that if all the derivative stuff started steamrolling, it would outpace me, and people would think of the derivative stuff before they thought of me, and the stuff that I'd been working so hard on would turn into a joke. Like, because I could obviously see that happening to, like, other less popular artists on the internet, like my go-to of internet punching bag. I have no idea what he's up to these days. David Gonterman. Because David Gonterman is probably still writing stories that appeal to his fan base of probably 24 people, and they're still more well known among people who hate them instead. And that's probably what I was fearing when I was starting out. But over time, it eventually became that with enough popularity, like a sufficient amount of popularity, well, any sort of derivative work would need to gain this much momentum that I already have in order to overtake me, and that's not going to happen. So there's not really any point in getting worked up over fan works outshining me or supplanting the stuff that I'm trying to express, or basically talking over me. That's not going to happen. I don't really need to worry about that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Our NFC's fan works.
Yeah, it's free. It's free advertising for the IP, and basically, no matter what people do, Rick is still going to be the highest quality source of House Pets content. I say House Pets, but
Yeah.
other settings as well.
And if it's in Haven Celestia, if like, I don't know, Neil Gaiman came down out of the heavens to write a Haven Celestia story, that'd still benefit me. Because it's necessarily already out of the Wild West of just random fan work projects already, so.
And fan works of Even Celestia kind of the canon, something? I mean, there were the anthology, and sometimes, or maybe often, I got the feel that they were just high quality and well edited fan fictions that happen to be original stories in a setting. I mean, I'm not sure I'm very clear, but isn't the fact that Heaven Celestia is a kind of an open universe mean that some fan stories are just stories within the universe?
Well, see, because
It's open in that you can write in it, but it's not open in that anything that's written is automatically canon.
yeah, because the canonicity still like sort of flows out from me and Greg and some sort of vague consensus in that area.
Just minor, if you speak, if you talk too fast, I can't understand you.
Basically, I think the answer is kind of, it works kind of like the old kind of Star Wars universe did, where the films are canon, and then officially, like as you go further away from creation and stuff like that, like things get, the canonicity of things becomes less and less agreed upon or solid and stuff like that. So, I mean, yeah, you could come up with some story that exists sort of in this universe, but is not otherwise connected to, like, if you were a literary scholar analyzing all of this material that exists that claims to take place in like the Haven Celestia universe, you could say, oh well, there's this one story that isn't connected to these other things or isn't cross-referenced and stuff like that, and what makes, like, it would be difficult to make the argument that, no, this story did not happen. These things are not sort of there. But that's not what you're really trying to prove. I mean, what you're really trying to figure out is what actually is sort of included. What are the set of facts that make up known canon? And that really comes from like the official sort of material and stuff like that. I know that was really complicated. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
My main idea for the canon of Haven Celestia is that I want there to be like a quality filter before I am willing to say anything in particular is, yes, 100%, at least insofar as it can be, canon in the universe. And you have put like basically just the qualifier of you need to be able to publish it, because the actual process of getting there should be enough to ensure at least a baseline of quality that I want. And it's mostly because that's also another marketing thing, is because like if you publish a story, if somebody publishes a story in the Haven Celestia universe, then we agree that yes, this is good enough to become canon, then I have said that my works basically advertise for yours, and your works advertise for mine. That's it. Builds on the popularity, and by ensuring the quality that somebody will not necessarily pick up a book and say, no, this is garbage. This entire universe is garbage. I'm never going to read it again. It's sort of why but like before that, even the stuff that isn't published yet, it's sort of in a quasi-canon, because a lot of people have agreed, yes, these are good ideas, we like them, we want to see stories develop around them. We don't necessarily know exactly all the details that would fit into that to make it into something canon. Like all the stuff that's currently only partially published on Greg's and my Patreon. That's all quasi-canon. Possibly, hopefully, canon at some point in the future, but until then, we don't know. You can't really build off of it until it becomes canon.
And I think I remember that Greg wrote a few stories that are supposed to be fan fictions written by characters inside the universe.
I don't think you need to like make a justification like that. It's like I guess it's a way that you can think of it. Especially Greg's weirder stories like the Shrink Ray. That's obviously not hard science fiction, but it's a fun idea that he wants to play around. So he just says, okay, this may be something that is a fictional inside the universe, and you can sort of get away with the soft science fiction just by doing that. But if he was going to publish something like that, that probably needs some more framing device to it. In order to say, no, this is entirely fictional. And it's like we have an actual framing device or framing story that it actually exists in the universe so that it can be placed into the universe somehow.
I'm trying to think of any more questions right now. Forgive me. It's just that everybody's covered a lot of stuff I would have. Oh, I might actually have a question. With all the game streaming you do and all, are there any recent games you've played lately that have given you inspiration for anything you might work on in the future?
I mean, several of them. I mean, I literally just played Tunic, and it gave me inspiration for things that I might want to include in games in the future. And before that, I played Chicory, which was very similar. Basically, everything I've played that Finji has released so far. But it's like mostly a matter of just connecting with something in particular that's like, I really like how they did this in this game. That speaks to me. I would want to try to express something similar to that in my game. That's basically how that works.
Chat says, I have a question with names. When naming characters in sci-fi, how do you come up with futuristic names that don't sound too campy? Do you use alterations of already existing names?
I mean, sort of. You just come up with something that sounds good to your ears, really.
I know if
Like I don't necessarily know what you fear is being too campy with your names, because campiness is just like being bombastic where it doesn't necessarily feel like it would otherwise fit. So if the names sound absurdly grandiose to you, well, maybe you just try simpler names. Just try something that sounds maybe sort of comical, but when you hear it like 10 dozen times, it just kind of becomes kind of normal. Or you hear something that is sort of a mouthful, but then the characters just always call that character by a nickname that's just part of that name that's been chopped off. I don't know.
the camp comes when you have a character named like Kizzlefix the Harbinger.
Yes.
Whereas I would make a character named Rocky, which is Raki, and I would just take the word rake and replace E with I. And then there we go. I got a name.
Yes.
Silly names can work if the medium suits it. Like from Hitchhiker's Guide, you have Zaphod Beeblebrox and all that type of stuff. You can give characterization to your characters, even if silliness is imparted through kind of good choices there.
You can definitely get away with that in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy because it's necessarily a very silly story. So a character having a very silly name is just par for the course.
I know for the Guru at least, or Jeru, we made a name generator that stitched together phonemes. And I remember it producing some weird results at the beginning, and that's how we originally got EE the Warrior.
That name generator has been very handy for me. I'd love one for the rest of the major species when anyone gets a chance.
That's actually kind of cool. I'm coming up with character names for myself, partly for writing, but for designing new characters and stuff like that. I go to, this is probably a bad approach, but just going into sort of conlang stuff and just thinking, like Miller, you mentioned about developing sort of a phonology there, just kind of putting phonemes and stuff together. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is a language that's relatively poor. I want this language to be relatively poor in vowels, but have certain number of consonants, but uses the example of, I keep forgetting, I don't know if it's Sammamish, whatever, First Nation language in Pacific Northwest, where Seattle comes, the TL combination, like as a distinct consonant, and sort of doing that. And I'm like, all right, I now have a character, Thantloy, for they use for D&D stuff like that. Yeah, it's so. But I get your pain. It is difficult. I spend too much time on it.
Yeah, I was looking back on my Arunian story to be like, how did I do names in that? I remember I was just doing like things that would sound faintly Greek. So Nilus, Oris, Corolus, Galadius. But then there's like, some weird ones in there like Mayoko and Bandergiles. Which, if you're doing like a sci-fi thing and you have an entire species, you could explain it away of just being like, oh yeah, there were multiple languages across the planet, so of course the names aren't going to be all congruous.
Yeah, even there with surnames or place names in any sort of proper nouns in many languages often don't really fit into like the way the rest of the language sounds. Like English, like any place name in England, like is just like pretty out of line or kind of weird or kind of old feeling. So yeah, you have some freedom. You have quite a bit of freedom with those things.
Also, it's like when I was making up the Montrose names for my story that posted on Patreon. My basic rule of thumb was that the names should basically sound absurdly adorable. And that works perfectly well, even if it's out of context. It's kind of silly that these characters have adorable sounding names, but when you've listened to them for any period of time, they just start sounding like names eventually. So it's like it's not necessarily something that you need to be like over concerned about, so long as the people reading can actually be able to pronounce the names in their head. It's probably going to be fine.
I will say the one other story I'm working on at the moment. Every time I mention their name, all it says is main character. Main character said X. Main character does X. Because I'm just like, I don't know what their name is yet. I don't know. I'll figure it out some other point.
Yeah, you can use placeholders. If you're using placeholders, make them things that are like very difficult to accidentally find and replace with, like some relatively unique strings. But if you have like,
yeah, I do all caps, all caps, no space.
Yep.
Oh yeah, there's a question. Where did the name Rick Griffin come from?
That's a story and a half. No, it's not actually that intricate.
We got about 4 hours.
No, I was doing like, what is it, like role playing back in like 2001, 2002, I think it would have been 2001.
I always assume Rick Griffin's your actual name. Huh.
No, it isn't.
Okay. I feel dumb now.
Like, I needed to come up with a name for the Typhlosion character at the time, and I didn't want to use my real name, so I just decided to come up with something that sounded vaguely appropriate that would also work as a name for a Typhlosion, but he ended up getting the nickname Chindy anyway, so that's what he's known as now, and...
Oh, he did become Chindy. Okay.
Yes.
I was going to ask. So when this isn't necessarily writing related, but so when you started like being more open about drawing your characters' nude genitalia and stuff like that, how long ago were those like character designs and models kind of like set in your head? I was just thinking, just because one of the pinups and stuff available, the prints available of some of these characters, including Jindy having massive proportions.
That's always been a thing.
Yeah.
I was in middle school when I came up with him, so bunch of weirdness going to go on there.
That's relatable. Yeah.
Okay, I definitely need to take a break from talking, so I am going to sign out of Discord chat and resume smooth lo-fi music for the stream.
Thanks for Q&A, Rick.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Rick. Yeah.
We'll be doing something else at some other time. See you.